Hey geeks, and happy October! So, here at Average Geek, we're going to attempt to do something that we haven't attempted before. We love Halloween and we love October, so we're going to attempt to do at least one video a day. Now, we might not make this goal, but we're sure as heck going to try. There's so much stuff to talk about, for Halloween that, there's plenty to go on. We're going to be doing a ton of, movie reviews. Loki's going to be streaming horror games, it probably once-ish a week. He's going to be doing videos on zombies and more specifically George Romero and George Romero zombies. I'm going to be covering a lot of stuff as well. I ordered the horror block last month, which should be arriving sometime next week. Just for you guys, because I have no personal interest in the horror block, really. And I'm going to be doing a lot of, simple top fives, where we break down different, horrible villains, monsters, what have you. And actually, this is our first video of October, and this is going to be the first top five you'll see. And today I'm doing top 5 classic movie monsters. So let's get started, huh? Number 5 is probably semi-arguable as to whether it would actually, meet the criteria, I guess you could say, for a classic movie monster. It's definitely a movie monster. It is the youngest on my list. And it's probably the only one that didn't start as a written novel in our history, but it still has quite an effect on people. When I've asked people, if you could name the top 5 classic movie monsters, this was still on the list, so that's why it's included at number 5. And that's actually the Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing is actually, like I said, the youngest. It actually didn't come out until 1982 and is the only one on the list that's actually based on a comic book. The comic was actually put out by DC Comics, which, of course, I am a huge fan. So in that way, it still actually, is kind of coming from written material. So one of the reasons it's also on the list is because, well, when you're a movie directed by the late and great Wes Craven, it's a pretty good start to making the list. The story itself follows a scientist whose work is sabotaged by a paramilitary douche and ends up getting covered in his own chemicals and set on fire. Not a good way to go. Unfortunately, he ends up running into the swamp where everyone thinks he's going to die, but unfortunately for his enemy, he eventually emerges from the swamp as a half-plant, half-animal creature. Now, most people would think that's stupid and lame, but the extensive physical effects and makeup used for the film had a huge creep factor, especially when you think about the fact it was in the early 80s. Super cool flick. Made the top 5 for me. What do you think on that one? You probably disagree, but that's okay. Number 4 is another movie that has kind of permeated the senses and built off of public fear, and that is actually The Mummy. The classic film from 1932, starring the movie monster great Boris Karloff, gave the masses chills. The movie was actually inspired by the 1922 discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb and the frightening prospect of the Curse of the Pharaohs. Given that almost all of those involved with the opening of the tomb ended up dying within a year or two of the event, there was at least some real-life basis for that fear, which is the best thing for a horror movie, in my opinion. The 1999 film The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, is a movie most of us are familiar with and is widely considered a loose remake of the 1932 film, as they both revolve around the same central character, Imhotep. The newer movie, though, and its subsequently less than stellar prequels, um, which I must say I actually loved the first prequel, The Mummy Returns. Excellent movie. Um, Most of them actually diverged pretty quickly from its original inspiration. Uh, Still, The Mummy is, I rate higher than The Swamp Thing because it does have a longer longevity. And also, there was more movies than just the original and then the new Mummy, but I think those two resonate the most with the public eye. Number three is one that has a ton of remakes, a ton of versions of it, and is originating from one of the most well-known horror novels of its time, and probably kicked off a huge bit of the horror movie or horror novel genre, which led to the horror movie genre. And that's actually Frankenstein's Monster. Widely considered as one of the original triad of classic monsters, it was first brought to the masses in a book by Mary Shelley in 1818, which, is a long-ass time ago. It was 2 years from the time she began writing it, when she was, I think, 18, to its publication when she was 20, and was originally created on a bet between herself, her future husband, Sir Byron, and John Polidori to see who could write the best horror story. Which I bet you they probably didn't think it would be her. The first film adaptation was released in 1910, but it wouldn't be until 3 movies later, in the 1931 movie Frankenstein, also starring the great Boris Karloff as the monster himself, before it would gain any super notoriety as far as the films went. Karloff would return to the role in the 2 well-known sequels, The Bride of Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein, which subsequently was the last one that he ever made. Since this trio of Frankenstein movies, there's at least once a decade been a story of Frankenstein Monster brought to the big screen. At least once a decade. That's pretty huge. That's pretty popular. The latest one so far is Victor Frankenstein, which is starring James McAvoy and Daniel Radcliffe from Harry Potter. Daniel Radcliffe is actually playing Igor. I've seen the trailers for this. The one thing I'm concerned about is actually Daniel Radcliffe's wig, because if that's real hair, that's kind of frightening. Moving on, number 2, and very close to number 1. It dates back to legend and folklore from, European fears, well beyond the 1500s, is the werewolf. Now, legends and folklore surrounding the existence of the werewolf have existed for, like I said, a really long time. Long enough, let's put it this way, long enough, those suspected of being werewolves were persecuted along with the witches during the witch trials, and even earlier before that. That's how deep this fear of werewolves ran. The first time a werewolf graced the big screen, however, was 1935's Werewolf in London. The movie involves a scientist, and actually involves no mention of the effects of silver, which in most cases in werewolf movies we know is supposed to kill them or at least grievously affect them, and no lore revolving around the cannibalism, aka being transformed due to a bite. Instead, the movie relied on a plant transforming the man. He kept much of his human form due to the actor's unwillingness to put on extensive makeup. He didn't want to sit in a chair for a few hours, which can't say I blame him, because that is rather tiresome. It actually wouldn't be until the 1941 Wolfman that werewolves became permanently ingrained in the public's attention, spawning multiple movies, books, and even an RP game from White Wolf. The movie portrayed the werewolf as a sympathetic character, which actually would snowball even more with future werewolf movies and gradually evolve werewolf characters into more compelling and sometimes heroic personas, which actually is shown pretty extensively in the Underworld series, which actually features our number one ish, which is actually vampires, or more specifically, Dracula himself. While the legend of vampires, again, has been around for quite some time, fairly on par with, that of werewolves, it wasn't until Stoker's Dracula that it would fully be permeated into the public's consciousness. Though the story met with some criticisms through the years, as people debated how much Stoker actually knew of Vlad III from Romanian history, it's generally believed that Vlad was actually largely inspiration for Dracula. Wow, I can talk. One of the first films to actually feature Dracula was the 1922 movie Nosferatu, which is actually also the first time that Nosferatu, the word, became associated with vampires in public culture, in pop culture, what we should say. Though the vampire in the movie is referred to as Count Orlok, it's actually common knowledge that the vampire is in fact Dracula, but they had to change the name because he was produced without permission of Stoker's widow, which actually led for a lot of problems for that movie. Since then, funnily enough and crazily enough, one of the main reasons he's actually number one on our top 5 is since then he has been in over 217 different films, which ranks it second to only Sherlock Holmes. Like, Dracula has been featured by name in 217 films. Let that sink in as to how important to the horror genre Dracula actually is. He has also been the inspiration of many, many vampire stories and movies over the years, including Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire series, Buffy, the Underworld series, Vampire Diaries, Twilight, which I say begrudgingly. I mean, it's had a huge impact on the culture of horror. Been around forever. Okay, bad pun, I know. So that's our top 5 classic movie monsters and video number 1 for October. See you tomorrow. Later, geeks.